He was the most magnetic person she had ever met. Not just attractive, magnetic. The kind of person who made you feel, in the first 20 minutes of knowing them, that you had been waiting your whole life for exactly this conversation, that they saw something in you that nobody else had seen, that the world was more interesting, more alive, more full of possibility when they were in it. She told her friends about him. They were skeptical. She told them they didn't understand. She moved in with him 8 months later. 18 months after that, she sat in a therapist's office describing a version of herself she didn't recognize, someone who apologized constantly, who had stopped trusting her own perceptions, who had built her entire daily existence around managing the emotional weather of another person. The therapist used a word. She had heard it before. Everyone had heard it before. But she had never heard it explained. She had read the lists. 12 signs you are with a narcissist, 7 things narcissists always say, how to spot one in the first conversation. She had recognized him in every item on every list, but knowing the label had not answered the question that was keeping her awake at night. Is he a narcissist? She had stopped needing that confirmed months ago. The question was different, harder, more important. Why is he like this? Not as an excuse. Not to find a reason to stay, but because she had spent 18 months trying to reach something inside him that she could not find, and she needed to understand whether that thing existed and was hidden from her, or whether it had never been there at all. That question has a precise neurological answer, and it changes everything about how you understand this pattern. Welcome to Dr. Cole's Dark Psychology. I'm Dr. Evan Cole, behavioral psychologist and behavioral analyst. On this channel, we examine human behavior at the level it actually operates, not the surface, the mechanism underneath. The word narcissism has become one of the most used and most misused terms in all of popular psychology. It is used to describe everyone from difficult partners to public figures to anyone who posts too many photographs of themselves online. That overuse has done something damaging to our understanding of what narcissism actually is at the clinical and neurological level, and why the people who have it behave the way they do. Today we go beneath the label, into the research, into the neuroscience, into the specific architecture of the narcissistic self, how it was built, what it is protecting, and why the behaviors it produces are so consistent, so predictable, and, from the outside, impossibly difficult to change. This is not a list of warning signs. This is the psychology underneath them. Before anything else, a precise definition, because the word is used so broadly that it has lost much of its clinical specificity. Narcissistic personality disorder. The clinical diagnosis at the severe end of the narcissistic spectrum is characterized by a pervasive pattern of grandiosity, a persistent need for admiration, and a significant deficit in the capacity for empathy. But those 3 features, grandiosity, admiration-seeking, empathy deficit, are the visible surface of the condition. They are not what narcissism is. They are what narcissism does to protect what narcissism actually is. And what narcissism actually is, at its core, at its origin, at the level where the architecture was first built, is a self organized entirely around the management of shame. Not confidence, not ego, not selfishness, shame. That single reframe from the grandiose self that appears on the surface to the shame-organized self underneath it is the key that unlocks everything else. Every behavior that feels inexplicable from the outside becomes, once you understand that key, entirely predictable. The narcissistic self is not built in adulthood, it is built in childhood, in response to an environment that, for one reason or another, made authentic selfhood feel profoundly unsafe. This is not universal. There are multiple developmental pathways into narcissistic personality organization, but the most consistently documented in the research involves early experiences in which the child's genuine emotional reality, their real feelings, real needs, real vulnerabilities, were either consistently dismissed, ridiculed, or made contingent on performance. The child who learns that love is conditional on achievement, the child whose authentic emotional displays were met with contempt or withdrawal, the child who is alternately idealized and devalued by a parent whose own emotional regulation was unstable. In each of these environments, the child faces an impossible choice: continue to bring the real self, the vulnerable, needing, uncertain self, into a world that has demonstrated it will not be received safely, or build a replacement. The replacement is the grandiose self, the self that does not need, that is never uncertain, that is superior rather than vulnerable, that demands admiration rather than risking the exposure of genuine desire for connection. This replacement self is not a performance the person is consciously putting on. It is a structure the psyche built, slowly, over years, in response to genuine developmental necessity to protect the authentic self from an environment it learned was not safe. The grandiose self is not the narcissist. It is the armor the narcissist built when they were too young to have any other option. Understanding this changes the question entirely. The question is no longer, why is this person so selfish, so cruel, so incapable of seeing anyone beyond themselves? The question is, what happened to the self underneath the armor? And that question has a far more disturbing answer. The neurological research on narcissistic personality disorder is among the most illuminating and most underreported findings in all of personality science. Multiple neuroimaging studies have identified specific structural and functional differences in the brains of individuals with narcissistic personality disorder compared to control populations. The most consistently documented finding involves the insula, the brain region primarily responsible for empathy processing, emotional recognition, and the capacity to feel what others feel. In individuals with high narcissistic traits, the insula shows measurably reduced cortical thickness compared to control populations. Reduced cortical thickness in this region correlates directly with reduced capacity for the kind of automatic, effortless empathic resonance that most people experience as a natural feature of human connection. This is a critical finding, and it is one that almost nobody who uses the word narcissism has ever heard. The empathy deficit in narcissism is not a choice. It is, at least in part, a neurological condition, reflected in measurable differences in brain structure. A second and equally important finding involves the threat-response architecture of the narcissistic brain. Research has consistently shown that individuals with narcissistic personality disorder display a significantly heightened amygdala response to perceived social threat, specifically to criticism, rejection, and anything that challenges the grandiose self-concept. This hyper-reactive threat response produces the behavior that people in relationships with narcissists find most destabilizing: the explosive, disproportionate reaction to what appeared to be a minor criticism, the immediate pivot from charm to rage, the complete inability to tolerate even the gentlest challenge to their self-image. This is not theatrics. It is not manipulation for its own sake. It is the amygdala of a person whose entire psychological architecture is organized around protecting a shame core, firing at maximum intensity the moment that core is perceived to be in danger. The threat was not the criticism. The threat was the possibility, however remote, that the grandiose self is not real. And that possibility is the most intolerable experience the narcissistic psyche can encounter. But cognitive empathy is frequently intact. The narcissistic person can often understand, intellectually, analytically, what another person is feeling. They can model emotional states. They can predict responses. They can, when motivated, produce behavior that appears empathic. This distinction is what produces one of the most disorienting experiences people describe from relationships with narcissists: the moments of apparent understanding, the conversations where they seem to truly see you, the times when the empathy appeared to be real and felt real, and then was gone again as if it had never existed. It was real in the cognitive sense. What it was not was automatic, unconditional, or primary. It was effortful, available when it served the narcissist's needs, absent when it didn't. Switched on and off, not by cruelty, but by a brain that does not generate emotional resonance the way most brains do, and substitutes, when needed, an intellectual model of what resonance looks like. That substitution is not the same thing as the real one, and living with the difference, without understanding it, is one of the most destabilizing experiences in all of human relationships. People who have been in relationships with narcissists describe with remarkable consistency the same sequence of phases. The first phase is idealization, the most intense, most targeted, most overwhelming positive attention they have ever received. The feeling of being seen, chosen, uniquely valued. The sense that this relationship is different from anything that came before. This is not fabricated. The narcissistic brain's reward system responds intensely to new sources of admiration. And in the early phase of a relationship, the partner is the most abundant source of that admiration available. The investment of attention is real. The warmth is real. The feeling the partner experiences of being genuinely valued is a reasonable interpretation of what is actually occurring. But what is occurring is not what it appears to be. What the partner is experiencing as being loved is more precisely described as being used as a mirror. The narcissist is not seeing them. They are seeing their own reflection, the reflection of their grandiose self, confirmed and amplified by the partner's response. The second phase is devaluation. It arrives when the mirror stops reflecting what it needs to reflect, when the partner fails, inevitably humanly, to provide the consistent, unqualified admiration the narcissistic self requires, when they have a need of their own, when they offer a criticism, when they begin to exist as a full, complex person rather than a reflecting surface. The devaluation is not always loud. It is sometimes a gradual cooling, a withdrawal of attention, a flatness where warmth used to be, a shift in how the partner is spoken to and about. It is sometimes sudden, a single incident that triggers the hypersensitive threat response, producing a reaction that seems entirely disproportionate to the event. In both cases, the experience for the partner is the same. The person who saw them completely is now looking through them. The warmth that felt like home has become cold without explanation. And the question that will keep them in this dynamic for months or years after they should have left: what did I do to make them change? This is the most important section of this video, and it is the section that people in relationships with narcissists find the hardest to sit with. Can narcissism change? The clinical and neurological evidence is not encouraging, and being honest about that is more respectful than offering false hope. Narcissistic personality disorder is among the most treatment-resistant of all personality disorders, not because people with NPD cannot attend therapy, but because the therapeutic process, which requires the client to acknowledge vulnerability, sit with shame, and examine the self honestly, demands precisely the capacities that narcissistic personality organization was built to avoid. It does not distinguish between the safe environment of a therapy room and the environments it was built to survive. It does the same thing it always does. It defends, it externalizes, it reframes criticism as attack. It manages the therapist the way it manages everyone else. This does not mean change is impossible. Research does document cases of meaningful therapeutic progress, particularly with modalities specifically designed for personality disorders, extended over years, with a therapist who understands the architecture. But that change requires the narcissistic person to want it, to recognize the cost of the pattern to themselves, not just to others, to tolerate the exposure of the shame core they have been protecting since childhood. Most do not reach that threshold, not because they are incapable of suffering. They suffer enormously. The narcissistic existence is characterized by a fragility that the grandiose self works constantly to conceal. But because the pain of the pattern for them is mostly experienced as coming from outside, from people who do not appreciate them, do not understand them, do not give them what they deserve. The recognition that the source of the pain is internal, that it was built inside them before they had any say in the matter, requires a confrontation with the authentic self that the entire architecture was constructed to prevent. That confrontation, without significant therapeutic support, is one of the hardest things a human being can do. I want to spend the final section of this video on the person who has been in relationship with a narcissist, because this video has been, until now, primarily an explanation of the narcissist's experience, and the person on the outside deserves something more than an explanation. What they deserve to understand is this: the thing they were looking for in the moments of warmth, in the early idealization, in the conversations where connection felt completely real, was real, in the sense that the need behind it was real. The narcissist needed what every human being needs: to be seen, to be valued, to connect. The difference is that the structure built around that need, the grandiose self, the shame armor, the empathy architecture, made genuine reciprocal connection over time nearly impossible. Not because the person on the outside wasn't enough, because the person on the inside was organized at the deepest level around not being able to let enough be enough. That is not a verdict on either person. It is a description of what happens when a wound that was never treated is asked by someone who loves the person who carries it to heal on its own. Narcissism is not a personality type. It is not a flaw in character. It is not a choice. It is a structure built early, under conditions that made the authentic self feel unsafe, by a psyche that did the only thing it knew how to do, built walls high enough that the wound inside them could not be reached. The behaviors that emerge from that structure, the grandiosity, the lack of empathy, the cycles of idealization and devaluation, are not the narcissist. They are what the narcissist built to survive. Understanding that does not mean staying. It does not mean forgiving what cannot be forgiven. It does not mean continuing to offer yourself to a dynamic that is organized at its core around taking. It means understanding what you are actually dealing with. Not a person who chose not to love you properly. A person who was built, before you ever met them, in a way that made loving you properly nearly impossible. If this gave you a framework for something you have been trying to understand for a long time, that is exactly what this channel is built to do. Subscribe to Dr. Cole's Dark Psychology Every week, we go beneath the behavior, into the neuroscience and psychology of why people do what they do when they are in pain, in power, and in the grip of structures they built before they ever had a choice. No labels, no lists, no easy answers. Just the science underneath the behavior. We'll see you in the next one.